You thought awakening would fix you. You thought clarity would come rushing in, and that peace would flood your chest like light pouring through a broken window. However, now everything feels numb. You are not inspired. You are not on fire. Instead, you feel flat, empty, and quiet in all the wrong ways. As you stare at your ceiling, you find yourself wondering, why do I feel more lost now than before I ever woke up? This is the part no one warns you about, the period that follows the breakdown after the illusion shatters and the veil lifts. At first you feel powerful, as though you have escaped the matrix. However, slowly and without warning, this feeling begins to fade, not in a sudden crash, but in a quiet dissolve. It is as though your soul has turned down the volume on life and has forgotten to turn it back up. Consequently, you stop chasing and you stop caring. This is not in a self-destructive manner, but rather in that deep, hollow way reminiscent of an existential sigh. Then a question arises, soft at first, but subsequently screaming, "Is this truly awakening, or have I broken something inside me?" There is a strange paradox here. We are often told that awakening should ignite us and fill us with purpose. However, for many, particularly the deep thinkers, the empaths, and the seekers, it achieves the opposite effect. It empties us. I remember a conversation with a close friend who is bright, intuitive, and deeply spiritual. She devoured all the pertinent books, including those by Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts, and Krishnamurti. She experienced her moment of awakening, a dark night of the soul that cracked her open, allowing her to suddenly perceive it, the illusion of identity, the ego's trap, and the futility of chasing external success. Nevertheless, 2 months later, she was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and unable to move. She articulated, "I used to cry because I was not achieving enough. Now, I do not care whether I achieve anything at all. I thought awakening would illuminate me, not leave me in this state." Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, understood this phenomenon long before it became widely discussed or referenced using contemporary terms such as hashtags. Although he never employed New Age terminology, he comprehended the same fundamental truth: when the unconscious becomes conscious, something inevitably dies. Jung wrote that enlightenment does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This statement sounds beautiful until one fully comprehends its profound implications. Awakening is not merely a destination. Rather, it is a demolition. It represents the commencement of a psychological death. This constitutes the essence of Jungian shadow work, a process that involves not rising above one's darkness, but actively turning toward it. The aim is not to become more light-filled, but rather to become more whole. Achieving wholeness necessitates confronting those parts of oneself that one has spent a lifetime avoiding. This involves the death of the person you believed you were, accompanied by the collapse of the structures that once provided meaning to your life, including your goals, relationships, career, and even your sense of time. However, here lies the twist: your ego is not eradicated. It is merely confused. It has lost its guiding map, and when one loses their map, motivation is consequently lost. You are not broken, nor are you lazy or mentally ill. Instead, you are in a state of limbo. You have awakened from a previous state, but you have not yet awakened into something new or different. And this period, this sacred pause, this vast unknown is profoundly misunderstood. What you are currently experiencing is not failure, nor is it a spiritual regression. It is in fact ancient, sacred, and a form of initiation. Jung cautioned that modern life attempts to avoid this void, this sacred in-between space, this wilderness of the soul at all costs. However, he also believed it was essential. This emptiness is not a mistake. Rather, it represents the threshold to something real and true. This constitutes individuation, the sacred unraveling of all that is false, enabling your authentic self to finally emerge. However, nobody typically informs you about this particular aspect, do they? Therefore, let us discuss it and delve deeper into what is truly happening inside your psyche, following awakening, and why this strange loss of motivation might potentially represent the most powerful spiritual upgrade of your life, provided you comprehend it correctly. However, first, if you are someone who enjoys peeling back the layers of life and is curious about the invisible threads shaping your reality, then this is where you belong. We invite you to subscribe to Fractal Wisdom, as this channel serves as a sanctuary for seekers, sensitives, and those navigating the unusual and transformative path of awakening. Because if you have been drifting in that post-awakening fog, perhaps wondering where your spark has gone, allow me to assure you you are not experiencing mental instability. You are undergoing a process of transformation. What you are currently experiencing is not merely emotional, it is existential. It does not merely shift your thoughts, it fundamentally rewrites your operating system. The goals you previously sought to achieve, the to-do lists you meticulously created, the 5-year plans you formulated, and the hustle culture affirmations you embraced no longer resonate with you. This collapse of your former motivational system is precisely what shadow integration work reveals. It indicates that a significant portion of what once motivated you, such as achievement validation and the desire to prove your worth, was rooted in fear rather than truth. Consequently, when that fear loses its influence, the entire motivational engine stalls until a new kind of fuel begins to emerge from within. This occurs not because you are failing, but because your entire motivation system is undergoing a collapse. Carl Jung foresaw this phenomenon long before platforms like Instagram popularized simplified versions of such concepts and turned them into trends. Let us analyze this further. For most of your life, your motivation originated from your ego identity, specifically the projected you that you believed you were required to be. You desired to be seen, to succeed, to be loved, and to prove that you mattered. And this is not inherently wrong. It is an integral part of the human journey and a mechanism for survival. However, awakening dismantles that system, stripping away the borrowed dreams and inherited fears. What remains is silence until something deeper begins to emerge. And that precisely is where the real journey commences. You were inherently predisposed towards survival by conforming to what the world would accept. Consequently, you constructed a self, a persona, and learned how to be perceived as good, useful, and lovable. However, a crucial point often left unsaid is that this self was not your soul. It was merely your strategy for navigation. And the moment awakening removes that mask, the motivation associated with it similarly vanishes. Within Jung's methodology of shadow integration, this phase is referred to as confronting the persona, the false self that was constructed for the purpose of survival, seeking love, and gaining acceptance. It did not represent your essence, rather it functioned as your armor. And when that armor is relinquished, what remains can feel terrifyingly empty. Nevertheless, this is also the point where the real self begins to surface. Suddenly, your former goals feel hollow and your previous passions appear performative. You may scroll through the things you once cared about and feel nothing. And this perceived nothingness is terrifying because the ego interprets the absence of stimulation as failure. However, the soul, in contrast, perceives it as stillness. Furthermore, it is a state profoundly familiar to those engaged in Carl Jung's shadow work, where the soul is stripped of illusion and begins to thirst not for external validation, but for inherent meaning. It can be dry, silent, and at times unbearable, and yet it remains sacred. For it is only within the metaphoric desert that one truly comprehends the nature of thirst. Not a thirst for external validation, but a yearning for something real. Something that does not vanish when the applause fades, and something that does not crumble when one's roles disappear. This is precisely where true rebirth commences, not through the acquisition of more affirmations or fleeting dopamine hits from the next purported spiritual fix, but through cultivating the ability to reside within the sacred ache of nothingness until something deeper begins to stir. And indeed it will, not because it has been forced, but because silence, when sufficiently honored, ultimately gives birth to truth. Carl Jung did not romanticize this phase. He understood it as the night sea journey, a psychological descent into the depths of the unconscious mind, where the ego undergoes a form of death and the self begins to emerge. You are not lagging behind, nor are you broken. You are in essence within the womb of the real. And like any birth, this process is painful, disorienting, and raw. However, what awaits on the other side is not merely a new goal or an improved routine. It is the emergence of your true self. This is the self that does not need to hustle to feel significant, the self that no longer lives in reaction, but rather in alignment. The self that remembers motivation originates not from external pressure, but from internal presence. Therefore, if you are currently feeling empty, if your to-do list seems like a foreign language, and if your spark is nowhere to be found, pause. Do not attempt to rectify this state. You are not malfunctioning. You are undergoing transformation. This is not a breakdown. Rather, it is a breakthrough in disguise. And in the subsequent part of this journey, we will explore how to gently navigate this sacred in-between space. How to cease pursuing your former self and commence listening for the quiet whisper of your true self. For it is present, located beneath the numbness, beyond the noise, patiently awaiting your stillness to be heard. It is something older and quieter, a deeper pull rather than a frantic push. It does not emphatically command, "Be productive." Instead, it gently whispers, "Be present." This represents a form of motivation that does not originate from external schedules or calendars, but rather from your innermost core. You will not experience it in the same manner that you felt ambition. It does not ignite you with adrenaline, but instead grounds you much like gravity. You feel drawn instead of driven. You feel called, not coerced. And intriguingly, you might begin to desire less externally, but feel more internally. You might do less in terms of activity, but convey more meaning. You might speak less frequently, but carry greater truth. This is because the self, your authentic self, does not need to chase. It simply emanates. It does not require external validation or proof. It inherently expresses itself. And that fundamental shift, that sacred recalibration, is precisely where life begins to feel like alignment, rather than strenuous effort. However, this particular manifestation of motivation will not always be comprehensible to your former mindset. It does not conform to checking boxes or following linear logic. Instead, it moves in spirals adhering to the current of intuition, rather than the rigid blueprint of conventional achievement. Therefore, if you are currently in that specific phase where you seemingly cannot compel yourself to care about what once held significance, do not panic. You are not broken. You are undergoing a process of sacred reconstruction. You are shedding a borrowed identity in order to become something more honest, more whole, and ultimately, more truly yourself. Jung recognized that this represented the cost of authentic awakening, not merely enlightenment as an abstract concept, but transformation as a tangible lived reality. It necessitates relinquishing your illusions, your distractions, and your attachments to relentless hustle, external approval, and fabricated image. But in return for this relinquishment, you gain something that cannot be taken away, a stable center that cannot be shaken, and a life lived not for external applause, but for internal alignment. And if you allow it, this quiet new motivation will guide you towards aspects of life that do not merely appear superficially good, but genuinely feel true. This includes relationships that nourish instead of deplete, work that aligns with your being instead of drains your energy, and a path that requires the engagement of your soul, not merely the adherence to your schedule. Therefore, learn to trust the silence, trust the intervening space, and trust this strange middle phase. You are not lagging behind. You are precisely on time according to divine timing. The ego tends to rush, but the self, in contrast, roots itself deeply. And within the stillness you once feared, you may very well discover the first truly honest impulse you have ever experienced. It is no longer a frantic chase. It is a remembrance, a type of soul-led movement that does not roar, but rather hums softly through your bones. Akin to a memory you were unaware you were carrying, finally returning home. Jung referred to this as the emergence of the self, not merely as an abstract idea or a distant goal, but as a vibrant, living, and breathing inner compass. And if you find yourself in this phase now, it signifies something significant. You have successfully navigated the void resided within. The silence endured the stillness and relinquished what no longer served you. And currently, something begins to stir, not abruptly like a lightning bolt or a display of fireworks, but as a gentle pull emanating from somewhere deep within. This pull is not guiding you back towards your former life, but propelling you forward into something entirely new. This marks the point where the self begins to communicate not through explicit sentences, but via subtle nudges, through resonance, and in what Jung termed the symbolic life. He maintained that once the ego has surrendered and the unconscious begins to integrate, one becomes capable of living from a place far deeper than mere personality. And consequently, life undergoes a significant shift. It ceases being primarily about survival and begins to focus on meaning. However, here is the beautiful irony. This process is neither dramatic nor flashy. Instead, it is deeply ordinary, manifesting as a kind of quiet grace, woven into your every step. When the self is leading, one does not feel compelled to hustle. Rather, one responds authentically. You are no longer driven by the fear of missing out. Instead, you are guided by what authentically resonates with you. You do not implore clarity to manifest. You recognize it when it naturally arises. Living from the self does not imply that you will consistently feel motivated in the conventional sense. There may still be days characterized by fatigue, confusion, and even grief, as this is an inherent aspect of the human experience. However, you will no longer experience that familiar ache, the pervasive ache of compelling yourself through a life that feels inherently like a betrayal. Instead, something quieter begins to flourish. You commence creating even when no audience is present. You begin to decline opportunities that once impressed your ego, but ultimately starved your soul. You pursue your curiosity instead of rigidly adhering to a checklist. You consistently choose peace over performance. This precisely represents the new fuel. It is not fueled by adrenaline, it is powered by alignment. Jung referred to this as living symbolically, meaning not existing in mere fantasy, but with genuine soulfulness. This is where you begin to trust the inner language of dreams, the subtle whispers of your intuition, and the sacred timing of synchronicity. Consequently, what does this manifest as in practical terms? Sometimes it is as straightforward as posing different questions instead of asking, "What should I do?" You inquire, "What is quietly calling me?" Instead of asking, "What is the plan?" You consider, "Where is life nudging me?" Instead of asking, "How can I prove myself?" You contemplate what feels genuinely honest. You cease attempting to dominate life. Instead, you begin to participate authentically within it. And notably, this does not necessitate abandoning ambition. Rather, it involves its transfiguration. For authentic ambition, when guided by the soul, is not concerned with proving one's worth. It evolves into a devotion to truth, to presence, to growth, and even to the divine. And the inherent irony lies in this: that particular kind of energy, the kind deeply rooted in wholeness, rather than relentless hustle, accomplishes tasks in ways the ego never could. However, critically, it is now sustainable. It is now sacred. It is now soul-powered. This represents the motivation of the self, not to impress external observers, but purely to express its inherent nature. And that expression frequently compels one to create, to serve, to heal, to teach, and to build. This occurs not out of obligation, but because one's entire being whispers a resonant yes. Therefore, if you have been feeling as though your spark has vanished following awakening, perhaps this is because the old fire needed to be extinguished in order for you to discover a deeper, more enduring flame. Carl Jung never promised an easy path. His assurance was of an honest one. And if you are reading this now, still engaging with this content, it signifies that you are already traversing that path. This is not about attempting to reclaim your former drive. It is about discovering a fundamentally new one. One rooted not in external performance, but in internal presence. Not in perpetual striving, but in authentic becoming. Because this state is not the conclusion of your awakening. It marks the commencement of your becoming. And if this narrative has resonated with something sacred within you, or if it has assisted you in articulating what you have been quietly carrying, please leave a comment below and share how this journey has felt for you. Furthermore, if you desire more soul-aligned content of this nature where we delve into psychology, spirituality, Carl Jung's shadow work, and the meaning of truly living awake, we encourage you to subscribe to Fractal Wisdom. This is because awakening does not represent the conclusion of your narrative. Rather, it is precisely where your authentic story commences.